to view them as more than just victims. As we have seen across the world, young people can be powerful agents of change. Youth leaders have inspired intergenerational resistance and built global movements on issues of peace, justice, human rights, climate change, and other issues. Today, we're honored to feature a group of experts that will shed light on the unique risks faced by children and youth, as well as provide cross-regional insights on how children and youth can play a more prominent role in building societal resilience against cycles of atrocities. It is my pleasure to now pass the floor to Ms. Savita Pandey, Executive Director of the Global Center for R2P, to deliver a statement on behalf of the International Coalition for R2P. Savita.
Thank you, Jackie. Good morning, everyone. And it is my honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect. The International Coalition welcomes the Secretary General's report on R2P this year, which focuses on children and youth. As Jackie just said, children are particularly vulnerable to atrocities and are disproportionately impacted and targeted in situations where atrocity crimes are being perpetrated. In Syria, Yemen, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Nigeria, Ethiopia, Myanmar, Ukraine, and elsewhere, children and youth are at risk of being forcibly recruited, abducted, killed and maimed, raped, or subjected to other forms of sexual and gender-based violence. In many of these contexts, children are also being deprived of an education and access to health facilities, threatening their futures and livelihoods. Recognizing the specific risks to children and youth in non-conflict contexts is also imperative to comprehensively understanding the causes and consequences of atrocities. For example, children in Xinjiang, Uyghur Autonomous Region of China, have been deprived of rights on the basis of their race, religion, ethnicity, or nationality, and have been forcibly separated from their parents. In Afghanistan, the Taliban have perpetrated human rights abuses against girls, including systematic gender-based discrimination and violence. However, age alone rarely determines how a young person or child experiences atrocities. The impact of atrocity crimes on children and youth differ based on gender, class, racial, or ethnic background, among other factors. The need to secure the rights, protection, and welfare of children and youth are fundamental to upholding R2P, particularly the prevention of and response to atrocity crimes. Despite the fact that children and youth face unique vulnerabilities, young people are also powerful agents of change. Youth-led movements have immense contribution to global movements on issues of peace, justice, and human rights. The establishment of R2P signaled an opportunity to never again tolerate the inexcusable indifference demonstrated in the face of past atrocities. States agreed that political expediency would not excuse inaction when confronted with the most heinous of crimes. Atrocity crimes are not random incidents. There are a range of early warning signs that should serve as alarms to catalyze preventive action. Individual states, regional bodies, and the UN system, including the UN Security Council, the Human Rights Council, and the General Assembly, must more effectively seize these opportunities to not only save innocent lives, but also avoid costlier coercive measures. In this regard, governments as well as international and regional organizations should also deepen their cooperation with civil society. Civil society actors are often the first to witness the indicators and early warning signs of atrocities and are thus equipped with an in-depth understanding and expertise that states should incorporate into an atrocity prevention response. Furthermore, civil society has continuously been at the forefront of addressing atrocities by promoting justice and accountability, monitoring and reporting on international law violations, and working directly with affected communities. By placing the voices and rights of local actors, particularly the most affected by ongoing atrocities, including children and youth, at the heart of decision-making processes, the international community can take more appropriate and effective preventive action that is rights-based, community-informed, and responsive to early warning signs of atrocities. At a time when the world is confronted with unprecedented levels of violence, atrocities, and displacement, ICRTP stands ready as a partner for individual states, regional bodies, and the international community to ensure that our enduring responsibility to protect is upheld with consistency, courage, and without exception. Thank you very much. Please note that this is an abridged version of the statement. For the full statement, You can access our social media, ICRTP social media, and the Global Center website. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Savita, and thank you to the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect for sharing those words. Now I'd like to call on Mr. George Okoth-Obo, the UN Special Advisor of the Secretary General on the Responsibility to Protect.
Good morning, Jacqueline. Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me well. Okay, I have to begin with an apology. My schedule has changed a little bit, which prevents me from being here right through to the end of the event. So I am grateful to you, Jacqueline, and your colleagues for this adjustment that allows me to make really some remarks at the beginning. But I'll stay up to about a quarter to the hour and look forward very much to hearing this initial turnaround on the report, which is the first report that has been prepared during my term as the special advisor. I have overseen the preparation of the report. So let us say that I also have a particular selfish interest in this discussion, never mind, of course, the discussion tomorrow. I'm very glad to have this opportunity of a second encounter with the coalition. As I said in our previous engagement, and you will hear that I'll repeat that as one of probably the most important points that I would like really to share across here today. The report, as you have seen, and Savita already mentioned it in the remarks, has a very key theme of agency and participation and engagement to move this matter forward. I think if we had to look at another constituency in which the issue of agency is fundamental, it is the community represented in this discussion. So in trying to be brief, I have about 3 sets of comments which really influence the expectation that I have in your reaction to the report. The first one is, and I have already heard what Savita has said, it brought a smile to my face, but really the question is, have we got it right? Has the report captured the subject, both horizontally, comprehensively, but particularly vertically in terms of the criticalities? In preparing this report, my ambition was that we should try to get it, if not as comprehensively as possible, but as critically as possible. So I will be happy to hear your take on that, but also to be fairly open about some of the issues which I recognized we did not have the sufficient scope to deal as comprehensively as we would have dealt with otherwise. And I can share 2 of them. The first one is, you will have seen that the report recognizes very much the importance of other agendas. And one of its recommendations, whether it is with reference to the CAC agenda, the YPS agenda, the Women and Peace and Security agenda, that these remain valid and important, should continue to be really an important platform in moving action to protect children and youth from the risk and impact of atrocities. So it recognizes that, but then calls for even more sharpness for an atrocity prevention and response lens. That bit there about what does this lens represent, I have to say that we did not have sufficient scope and sufficient time to explore it much more, because the recommendation hangs on that point. So what does it mean? And in looking at this, the work and the collaboration that we will have together after the discussion tomorrow, this is clearly one of the issues that we recognize already going into the discussion tomorrow. The second one is, as you have seen, it is a blended report that brings children together with youth in the same space. Has this been successful? Is there something that could have been more bespoke for one group as contrasted with the other, that maybe the report as is now will need to develop? And here again, I want to be a little bit open about this. And it concerns the issue of protection in particular, because in exploring that question, it is obvious that the protection construct is very strong with regard to children, but with regard to youth, I think you will have seen that the report acknowledges this point, but does not go far enough in exploring what really is the meaning of that and all the questions that come with it in exploring and applying a construct of protection to youth as contrasted with children. So we recognize that that is an issue going forward. But I cite these two examples as really underscoring this question that I'm very interested to hear from you all, both now and after the discussion tomorrow as we work together. Have we got it right? The second set of issues that I wanted to share with you and put on the table has to do with what happens after this report is done with tomorrow in the discussion. What is next? Here now, I would like to go back to what I highlighted the most of all in our previous conversation is, to me, the 7 recommendations you have seen at the end of the report are set very much within the space of implementation. And there, I'm sure from the 2 questions that have been posed, a lot will come out of it. If I could share 2 really that exercise me a lot, but one of them is not too different from one of the questions that has been posed, is, as you will have seen, the report is set very much in the context of early warning and prevention, and that is important. But if it is true that nearly 300,000 children today, as we speak right now, are impacted by a risk or actual impact of atrocity crimes in more than 30 conflicts, the issue for those 300,000 children is not only prevention, it is response. But what does that mean? What does response mean? The report really just anticipates that question, but it doesn't go too much into it. In the parts of it that talks of some of the things that Savita already highlighted, including education and so on, are part of it. But I think that is one issue that we need perhaps, if not tomorrow, but certainly after, to come back to it. And the second one, Savita already mentioned, and to me it is so key, and that is the role of civil society. Because again, there, when it comes really to engagement on the ground with these communities, the community of children and youth, civil society has a very, very crucial role. And then my last point. This is the first report that is going to be discussed by the General Assembly following the resolution last year that now places R2P as a permanent agenda item on the agenda of the General Assembly. What does that mean? What are the implications of this? In taking this particular report, shouldn't it be that those implications of this now being a permanent agenda item should also start to be part of the conversation? Does everything remain the same, or one or two things should change? Shouldn't there be a change that this is going to be the 14th report that has been presented to the General Assembly since 2009. You have seen that more and more of these reports are becoming singular to a particular theme, to a particular issue. Should we continue this way, or should we rather horizontalize the report so that it gives a broad sort of whole of R2P picture for purposes of a review, etc., etc., etc. Jacqueline, I'm already abusing my privilege, so I'll stop here. I promise that I'll stay as long as I can, and then I'll quietly move and then join again with you later on in a separate construct. Thanks very much for listening to me, and back to you.
Thank you so much for joining us today, George, and for giving such a thorough preview of the report. I think we're all refreshed and happy to know that you also view this as a start of a conversation on this issue, and not the report is done and the conversation is over, but something to continue reaching back to. I'll now turn to Adrienne Lepar, Director of Watchlist on Children in Armed Conflict and a renowned expert on children's rights. Adrian, as you know, this year's report focuses on the impact of atrocities on children and youth, as George has just discussed. Your organization, Watchlist, works on issues very closely related to atrocity prevention in the children and armed conflict space. Could you set the stage for us a bit today? What are the unique vulnerabilities faced by children and youth in atrocity and conflict situations?
Thanks, Jackie. And just before I share some reflections, I just want to say a big thank you to the International Coalition for the Responsibility to Protect and the Global Center for having me. And it's truly an honor to share the space with the distinguished panelists, especially the inspiring youth advocates who I'm really looking forward to hearing from today. So I'm going to speak a bit about, as you said, focus on the children armed conflict agenda. And as the special advisor so rightly pointed out, there are definitely some differences between children and youth, but I will try to capture a bit about both. So children, and that's referring to all people below the age of 18, account for almost a third of the world's population. And in many conflict-affected countries, children and youth make up approximately half of the national population. By virtue of their young age and physical and emotional immaturity, children have special needs and are among the most marginalized and most vulnerable members of society, and they're entitled to special care and protection under international law. However, armed conflicts today are too often characterized by high levels of violence against civilians, leading to deaths, injuries, psychological trauma, displacement, and family separation. By nature of their vulnerability, children suffer disproportionately from the harmful impacts of war. In fact, there are more children living in conflict zones today than at any other time in the previous 2 decades. These children face extreme levels of violence, and many have experienced serious and multiple forms of violations of their rights. Parties to conflict exploit the unique vulnerabilities of children, targeting them in distinct ways on the basis of their gender, age, disability, and other characteristics. And the COVID-19 pandemic has only further exacerbated the vulnerability of children and youth to rights violations and abuses. So let me describe a bit some of these. Homes, schools, hospitals, and other critical civilian infrastructure are often targeted for attack, with immediate and long-term impacts for the survival and well-being of children and youth, including their rights to education and health, and also often for many years after conflict has ended. In many contexts, attacks on schools and hospitals are often committed in conjunction with other grave violations against children, such as abductions, recruitment and use by armed forces and armed groups, and sexual violence. The use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in populated areas has resulted in deaths, physical injuries, and psychological trauma, and has hindered the ability of children, youth, and other civilians to safely return and rebuild once conflict has ended. Displacement due to armed conflict poses additional risks for children and youth, including vulnerability to trafficking, exploitation, recruitment and use, and other abuses, particularly for those who are unaccompanied or have been separated from their parents or caretakers. Armed conflict can also heighten children's risk of statelessness due to breakdown of civil registration procedures, being born in territories under the control of armed groups, or due to counterterrorism or citizen stripping measures that impact children who are allegedly associated with armed forces or armed groups. And in fact, we've witnessed a proliferation of counterterrorism measures over the past 20 years that lack adequate safeguards for human rights. And this has led to a shrinking of civic space, challenges to principled humanitarian action, and a growing disregard for international law, all of which undermine efforts to protect children and youth in armed conflict. Although international law recognizes children associated with armed forces and armed groups as victims of serious violations, children and youth in a number of contexts are being treated as threats and criminals, stripped of the rights and protections they're entitled to under the law. At times, children and youth are harassed or detained long after leaving the armed force or armed group. They're sometimes held for months or even years in deplorable conditions, lacking access to food or health care. They can also be subjected to torture or other cruel, degrading, and inhuman treatment. In the case of children of so-called foreign terrorist fighters, many home countries have refused to repatriate their nationals, including children, on the premise that they harbor extremist ideologies or pose a security threat. And many of these children have spent years languishing in crowded displacement camps and de facto detention facilities with limited access to basic services. Children and youth in detention are likely to suffer stigmatization, disruptions to their education and social development, and separation from their communities, jeopardizing their reintegration into society. In sum, when children and youth are deprived of the opportunity to grow, develop, and flourish, the impact is far-reaching and felt by their families, communities, and nations. Potential to future.
Thank you, Adrienne. And based on your experience, what do you see as the role of children and youth in peace building, as well as their role as agents of change? What are some of the opportunities and challenges regarding the participation of young people in this way?
Thanks, question, and hopefully a more hopeful response. So as you pointed out earlier, despite their vulnerabilities, children and youth are not all war. Rather, they're people with rights and agency who can meaningfully contribute to the protection of themselves and their communities, as well as efforts to build and sustain peace. The Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most widely accepted international human rights treaty ratified by all UN member states except the US, recognizes children's right to express their views freely in all matters affecting them. Security Council Resolution 2427, which focuses on promoting the protection of children throughout all stages of the conflict cycle, including peace building, calls on member states, UN entities, the Peace Building Commission, and other stakeholders to integrate provisions for the protection of children, their rights, and well-being into all peace negotiations and agreements, and to take into account children's views when possible in these processes. The participation of children and youth in peace building efforts is not only a right, but it also helps to build their capacity for active citizenship, contributes to breaking cycles of violence, and promotes long-term sustainable peace. When children and youth have the opportunity to share their perspectives, they demonstrate their ability to advance their own protection, end violence against them, and foster more inclusive and responsive social structures. Children and youth intimately understand the issues impacting their own lives and can envision sustainable, innovative solutions that can be more effective than those devised by adults. Moreover, the act of participating can itself help children and youth to better cope with the hardships of armed conflict and improve their self-confidence. By helping to increase their knowledge, capacity, and skills, participation can lead to changes in harmful power dynamics and reduce the vulnerability of children and youth to violence and other rights violations. Still, there are many barriers that prevent children and youth from fully realizing their right to engage in peace building and other decision-making processes affecting them. Adults, especially in policy-making fora, may view children and youth as too inexperienced or immature to participate, and they may continue to deny or hinder children and youth's access to decision-making processes. In some contexts, governments are increasingly censoring access to information, limiting civic space that's safe and accessible, and creating legal, administrative, or bureaucratic barriers to child and youth-led organizations. Children and youth who live in the most marginalized situations often face extreme barriers that inhibit their participation. These include displaced, refugee, or stateless children and youth, those with disabilities, girls, and children with non-conforming sexual orientation and gender identities. Policy and decision makers, including governments, the UN, and civil society, should promote the participation of children and youth in decision-making processes affecting them and provide accountability in response to their inputs, in line with the best interests of the child. Decision makers should remove barriers to children's participation, such as restrictive laws and practices, to ensure they can safely and meaningfully engage in peace building and other decision-making processes affecting them, where possible and again, where compatible with their best interests. Efforts to foster safe, meaningful participation by children and youth should also be inclusive, ensuring that children living in vulnerable or marginalized situations also have opportunities to be heard. Lastly, it's important to note that participation encompasses more than just having children and youth present in a meeting, process, or for the duration of a single project. Instead, it should be an ongoing exchange of information and dialogue based on mutual respect, in which children and youth have the opportunity to form and express their views freely. Their views are respected and taken seriously, and they can see the results of their participation and understand how their contributions have been taken into account. In this sense, to promote the participation of children and youth in peace building and other decision-making processes that affect them, we need to change societal attitudes, norms, and values towards children, youth, and their rights. The children and youth of today are the adults of tomorrow. They're often key sources of resilience, and their active participation is really critical for an effective reconstruction, economic development, and building sustainable peace.
Thank you for that, Adrienne. I think you've done a wonderful job setting the stage for us today, especially with that final point on how to engage children and youth in the long term. And so now I'll turn to our panel. For the discussion today, we are joined by a powerful and prominent group of youth advocates, all of whom are leading important work on atrocity prevention in regions across the world. So we have 4 speakers today. Ms. Nyon To of the Asia Pacific Youth Core Group on Atrocity Prevention, Mr. Khalid Inaudib, Executive Director of Justice Call and an organizing partner of the UN Major Group for Children and Youth, Ms. Kessie Ekomo Sonye, a local peacebuilding expert in the Central African Republic, and Mr. Detmer Kramer, a Policy and Communications Officer with Protection Approaches. So I'll start with a question for all 4 of you. Could you share with our audience some of your experiences doing this work? Are there positive examples in which young people in your region made a difference in terms of preventing and building resilience against atrocities? I'll start with Nyon.
Thank you for that question. I represent the Youth Core Group for Atrocity Prevention under the Asia Pacific Center for Responsibility to Protect. So we organize a series of activities in various countries in the Asia Pacific region. So for example, in Malaysia and Bangladesh, we organize consultation sessions with young people, understanding what young people think and how they view the human rights situations in their respective countries, the knowledge and attitudes to hate speech and atrocity crimes, as well as to explore the drivers and prevention strategies that young people can take. And then in Fiji and Malaysia, we also organize capacity building sessions for young people. This is to raise awareness, for example, about what constitutes hate speech or dangerous speech, its impact on society, and the precedents for perpetrators to be indicted and prosecuted. So there are trainings on the types of atrocity crimes and how atrocity crimes can happen in their respective countries, as well as taking into account the broader context of structural and societal conflict, entrenched gender inequality, systemic power imbalance, and human rights violations. Then the young people that we trained went on to conduct their own projects. So for example, in Malaysia, one group collected stories and shared experiences of hate speech on social media. So this helps to raise awareness on the kind of hate speech that people are experiencing. So for example, in Malaysia, many of these hate speech are related to races and religion. So and there are also hate speech targeted at marginalized communities such as the LGBTQI communities and refugees or migrants. Through this kind of projects, there were also many other survivors in these communities who reach out to us and ask if they could share their stories as well. And the participants that we train and engage with have mostly commented on how useful trainings like these are to them, because most of our formal schools curriculum, human rights, intercultural understanding, atrocity preventions are not taught. And in Indonesia, there was also a project that was organized to train 12 young filmmakers from marginalized communities with skills in raising awareness and telling stories of their community. So the project aimed to provide a means of healing for persecuted communities, to raise the voices of minorities or marginalized groups, and encourage dialogues among different groups. And then the films that they created were used as positive content to counter online hate speech as well. So so as you can see, many of the activities that we conducted focus on capacity building and raising awareness and understanding what young people think. And we think these are really important, first steps to empowering young people to do more. I agree that in countries where atrocity crimes are already happening, how can we respond? at the moment, at least in our context, we haven't been able to do much, but we also think that it is equally important to empower young people in countries where atrocities are not happening. There's no immediate threat of atrocities, but it's important to do the prevention work. Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you, Nyan. That's really powerful work and can have such a multiplicative effect when you're doing such widespread capacity building and training. Now I'll turn to Khalid.
Thank you so much. Thank you for giving us a chance to join you today and share about our work in the MENA region. As you explained, my name is Khalid Inaudib. I'm from Egypt, based in Washington, DC. I'm a human rights lawyer, and I will be happy to share some examples of our work about atrocity crime prevention. So actually, we have discussed all this challenges in the MENA region and the effect that armed conflict unfortunately left on youth and the children. As Adriana mentioned, we still have a lot of positive actions from young people on the ground in these countries to build resilience against atrocities and build sustainable peace. And we'll just start with introducing Justice Call, which is a youth-led organization aiming to build a peaceful and just society in the MENA region by working with young people. We have projects in Egypt, Sudan, Libya, Yemen, and Syria, but we also have regional projects. And I will here share two examples from the national level, but also regional level. For example, in Syria, we all know how situation is difficult with armed conflict that has been going in the last 10 years, authoritarian regime, shrinking civic spaces, which makes the work of NGOs and international organizations, UN agencies, very difficult to access local communities. But our youth partner in Syria were able to work at the local level with these organizations to reduce the tensions and bring actors together. For example, with the support of the UN Office of Genocide Prevention, R2B, and the ICR2B in 2020 and 2021, we launched a capacity building project to train youth-led groups in the MENA region on how to analyze atrocity crimes. So using this very interesting tool, the framework of analysis of atrocity crimes, which is very, very interesting. So we trained young youth-led organization, women-led organization, on how to use this to analyze atrocities and then to prepare actions themselves. And in Syria, as I mentioned, this has been used in the south of Syria by our partner there, Youth for Change, to work with local actors, including judges, non-government affiliated commanders and military, and also tribes, local actors, to work together to analyze and to be aware about the risks that this local situation, or like these villages or cities facing. And here we're not talking about the national level, we're talking more about very, very small scale, to talk about what kind of risks they are facing, and then to think together about solutions to kind of, as I said before, reduce the tensions between those people and bring those actors together through dialogue. And this was very, very effective. And also part of this project, we tried kind of to bring the gap between the international level and the very, very deep local level by getting a chance or creating bridge between those young people in Syria and UN high-level people to sit together for these young people to manage their expectations about the UN can do, but also to share their voices and make sure that the UN high-level people are aware about challenges facing those people in Syria. This is was amazing work, but again, the environment is very, very dangerous. Shrinking civic spaces, those young people always been targeted. There is no kind of a legal way for them to work and receive resources. And I will move quickly to Sudan. We have amazing partner, Adila organization, which is a woman-led organization working to simplify the peace building terms and agreements in a way that local communities can understand. So they use local language, not only standard Arabic, but they use local dialect that people can understand and relate to. And they also use arts to engage all the local communities, marginalized groups, women. They make theater in the street to bring these people together to understand what does it mean diversity, what does it mean peace building, because the issue and the challenge is facing us as civil society organization and NGOs that unfortunately people does not feel the peace building at the local level, doesn't know what is the R2P is. And I think we need to really get closer to these people to make sure that they are engaged and they are able to contribute to this work we do. Otherwise, our work will be stay in New York and Geneva, and local communities will still facing the dangerous. And just last April in south of Darfur, this was this huge mass conflict between two local communities, which is unfortunately resulted more than 200 deaths. And this was in a very local community. And here we say, where is the prevention of atrocity crimes? Why we always wait? We need to engage those people and to make sure that they understand and they are getting benefits from the work that we do. Yeah, I will stop here. With any further questions.
Thank you, Khalid, for sharing that and for your important work on creating those bridges between very local groups and the UN, as well as, ensuring that youth have a voice in solutions in their countries. Now I'll turn to Cassie.
Thank you very much. And I would like just to mention and say thank you to Leon and to Khalid, because I think that the work that we do, it's just incredible to see that this is the same struggle in different around the world, and we are doing the same things, trying like to really, prevent atrocity in our country. And that one thing that I would like to mention, I will add on what my colleague just mentioned, is like the core of our commitment as young people on the field it is the prevention of atrocity. Even though we don't use the word, even though we don't say it, this is why we are doing what we are doing. When we talk about peace, we talk about prevention of atrocity, but it's just that we don't put the word on it. And I will give the example of Central African Republic, like the commitment of young people in Central African Republic. We are from a generation, like we grow up in war. So we know what it is like atrocity and violence and mass violence. And just recently, we live it again. And so every single day, the work that we do is to try to find actually who will be our partner, our allies, to prevent those atrocities. And on the field, that the work that we are trying to do is really like to find those allies through the UN mission, for instance, because the mission of the UN mission MINUSCA in CAR is to protect the population. And this is where we found a kind of partnership where we are really trying to build like a space where the population can talk, but also be active. But by having also the presence of MINUSCA there. And we also, the work that we're also trying to do is to create like the bridge, as just Khaled mentioned, the bridge not just with the UN, but with our governments. It's key. Like if it's come to the responsibility to protect, it's not just about the UN. This is one of the main things that I want to mention. It's not just about the UN. It's also about like the commitment of our governments on the field, and not just at the national level, but even at the local level. So the work that we try to do is also to raise awareness, around the local authorities, to be sure that they understand, as Khaled mentioned, they understand the importance of it, and that all the things that we do, our commitment, as I just mentioned, is to really create a space where all of us, not just young people, not just children, but all of us, we can we can live in peace and feel that it's possible to see the future at some point. One other thing that I would like to mention when it comes to the role of young people in Africa in general, it's a connection. Our countries are we have cross-border conflict. So it means that we are not just focusing on our countries, we are also connecting with our peers out of our countries. So for instance, in CAR, we work a lot with South Sudan, we work a lot with DRC, we work a lot with Cameroon, because there's different dynamic that impacts the risk of conflict in our countries. And so by creating those links, it helps us really to, to play a role, but of course, the values of our role is not really taking into account, you know. We're still facing this kind of cute syndrome. I call it the cute syndrome, which means that when we do the work on the field, but no one really recognize it, if I can say it like that. And I think it's quite difficult for a lot of young people being so active on the field, trying to play the role and pushing for the prevention of atrocity, and to see that no one really pay attention to that or just recognize the work. Because, you know, the young people that are committed today are the ones that will lead the country tomorrow. And I think it's important to really respect the work that they do on the field, and to really keep the door open to them. So this is what I can add on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassie. And I think your opening there was really poignant. The idea that we all have the same struggle in different regions, or at least all of the youth who are active on this issue. And you're obviously playing a very important role, both today as well as in building towards the future. And lastly on this question, but certainly not least, I'll turn to Detmer.
Thank you so much. And also a huge thank you, of course, to the Global Center, International Coalition, and Jahan especially for bringing us all together. I'm really humbled to be speaking alongside such incredible activists from around the world. It's really, yeah, I'm just taking lots of notes. There's so many interesting things already coming out of this. Also a huge thank you, of course, to George, the special advisor, on his reports, as well as the questions he raised. And I hope we're already responding to some of those, and hope to continue to be able to share some of those reflections from our work that will help with that report. I think from my experience, what I kind of want to talk about, and this is something many of you have already touched upon, is yes, there's really shared vulnerabilities between youth and children, but there's also, like, children and youth are not a monolith. There's so many vastly diverse experiences within that community. And so I particularly wanted to touch upon a strand of work we've been doing at Protection Approaches on queering atrocity prevention, on the particular experiences and dynamics and leadership of LGBTQI+ folk in atrocity prevention spaces, particularly thinking again about LGBTQI+ youth. The ways that those communities have been targeted are not new, but still they tend to remain quite absent in a lot of the frameworks and conversations around atrocity prevention. Even though that role is going to grow, particularly when thinking about youth, as for example, over 40% of young people in the United States and Gen Z identify as LGBTQI+, as well as indigenous communities around the world are reclaiming non-hetero and non-binary identities that were lost through histories of colonialism. So I think it's a really important kind of community, particularly with the youth lens, to kind of engage with. I think a particularly powerful example is actually what we're seeing in Russia, where through a campaign actually designed to protect youth and children, LGBTQI+ communities have been demonized for over a decade through banning the discussion of LGBTQI+ issues in schools, a crackdown in civil society. And this has led to already a huge increase in violence, including torture, disappearance, and things like that across Russia, particularly impacting LGBTQI+ youth, with the most gruesome part of that, the most, not to create a hierarchy of it, but the most large-scale example of that being the purges in Chechnya that are actually still ongoing, where hundreds of LGBTQI+ individuals, particularly young people, were disappeared, were murdered, were tortured. Also, I think it's particularly important to think about these narratives when we see the invasion of Ukraine, where this hateful homophobic rhetoric has actually been used to justify that invasion. And so I think a really important thing to consider here is sometimes how the particular violence targeted towards the community is not just about the real violence that community experiences. So it's also how that violence can indicate what might come next, the kind of canary in the coal mine situation, if you will. I also think, and I love, Nanya, that you already raised this, of it's not just about situations currently undergoing mass violence or situations of conflict, or how those two sometimes happen at the same time. It's also about the prevention in spaces where those things are not happening, but there might be risks or there might be really worrisome developments. And one of the things that I want to name here especially, and that the report that we worked on also touches upon, is a really worrying rise of transphobia in the United Kingdom, the United States, and in many other global northwestern countries. And we're already seeing this really hateful campaign resulting in huge rises in violence experienced by particularly the transgender and non-binary communities. And there's particular ways, again, in which LGBTQI plus youth is vulnerable there. So if we think about homelessness, LGBTQI plus youth are in some cases over 50% of homeless populations. And as climate change is impacting our cities of heat islands and flash floods, and then these developments that poses particular risks to youth and children. But also thinking about conversion therapy practices, which have been recognized by the United Nations as a mode of torture, are applied to LGBTQI plus youth, particularly, again, transgender and non-binary youth are at higher risk in this moment of these torture practices in the United Kingdom based on recent announcements of legal plans. And so what I think here, what really I hope kind of responds to one of the questions George raised, thinking about early warning systems and responses and what those should look like. And I think this is something that has come across already from all the panelists, is that these responses and these systems must be developed with young people, with children, right from the get-go, and that it should be done in a way that's really inclusive, that is able to capture all the different experiences youth and children bring to the table, not just one type of experience, but really that vast range of those experiences. One of the pieces of work that particularly my colleague Farida is working on, the protection approaches, it's really exciting, is creating actually an indicator framework with LGBTQI plus communities around the world, including LGBTQI plus youth, on what those indicators of risk might look like, so we can help build those more inclusive systems. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Detmer, and thank you for the important work that you're doing with protection approaches on LGBTQ communities and youth in particular, and sort of expansion of our understanding of, as you put it, the vast range of experiences that youth and people as a whole have. So now we'll turn to our next question. As we've seen from your 4 presentations so far, your work has had tangible impact for affected populations on the ground, both in countries where conflicts are occurring, as well as in sort of preventive spaces, as some of you have highlighted. And we've started to witness increased attention on the role that young people across the world can play in peace building, such as through the Youth, Peace and Security Agenda, as well as this year's Secretary General's report on R2P. So what is your vision for the future, and how can the international community better support that vision? And for this question, I'll start with Detmer.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think it's such a timely question. And I think actually the Secretary General's report on R2P this year was such a timely intervention, because I think this question about youth and children always already important, but I think will only continue to grow in relevance. I think there's a few reasons for that. I think one is that we're really seeing that increased understanding and grappling with what does intergenerational trauma mean? What does it mean in terms of where prevention comes in? What does it mean for risks down the line, and how to prevent those? I think that's a really quickly growing conversation that's really important. I also think, as others have also already touched upon, we're seeing so many more mass movements around the world. Climate change and other crises will likely exacerbate those mass movements. And as we look at demographics of those movements, there's so many young people part of those movements. I think, again, the question only becomes more important. But also, there is the way that young people, I think, engage with one another differently now through cyberspace and social media, where I might have more connection and in common with someone across the world than someone from my own country, the Netherlands, who is a generation above me, based on how we relate to one another through that cyberspace. So I think there's a lot of opportunities there also for solidarity and exchange and knowledge building already, which is super exciting. And lastly, and Cassie, of course, you already talked about this, this question is always important, because children and youth are literally the future. They are, whether that future is positive or negative, they are the future nonetheless, because whatever they decide is what will come next, right? Like that is kind of where we go to. And so I do think the key of prevention lies there. So yeah, I think the question is timely, and I think the report is very timely. In terms of kind of what does this mean then for a vision, and then like a positive note that I hope to be able to end my remarks on, is that I think it's really important that because of these reasons, children and youth have very particular ideas, visions, solutions, perspectives that I think are really important to be part of the conversation. But I think something that is where my vision kind of comes in, and what international community can do to support some of that, is that also the resources and empowerment for children and youth then are really important and needed. And so I think that leads to three different quick remarks I want to make on that. So I think the first kind of step in that is that there needs to be really sincere engagement with young people and youth and children, especially those holding particular marginalized identities. I think it's really important to build that trust, to have that long-standing engagement, to earn that trust of these communities. And it's some of the work actually that I'm particularly inspired by some of my colleagues, Annie and Shimon, I saw in the audience, that do that work in London and across the UK of building those relationships and connections with young children, with children and young people. Because I think it is that building of relationship that allows you to go to step two, which is the inclusion of youth and children in conversations. Because I don't think it's just enough to invite young people, as Adriana and many other people have touched upon already. It's not enough to just invite us to the room. We also need to be able to actually be equipped with the tools to then flourish in that space, to change that space, to contribute to that space. It's not just about a seat at the table, it's thinking about what does the table actually look like. So I think that's really important. And the final bit in the vision, my grand vision for the future that I'm excited about, as well as where international community can come in, is that we are like, yes, we are the future, whatever exactly that means, but also we stand on the shoulders of people who came before us, right? And so I think it's really important to strengthen and draw from intergenerational knowledge and create much more platforms and spaces and intentionality in sharing all that knowledge and skills. I think there's tremendous power in intergenerational knowledge that we often don't quite see. And so I think what's really important is from international community to quite humbly and generously share that knowledge, share those resources. So young people don't have to reinvent the wheel every single time, can see what tools use, can see what tools work, can see what tools might not work in the situation, can tweak some tools. So they can also then, of course, share that knowledge of those older generations as well as generations to come. And just a tiny little plug here that I want to put in, one of the recent papers we've been working on democratic education needs imagination together with the Auschwitz Institute, trying to do exactly that of how can we bring practitioners and experts and academics and activists from all around the world together to share what works in the kind of education that we need to equip young people to build more inclusive and peaceful societies. Because there's so many tools already out there. And I think part of it is also making those tools actually available, not to force young people to use those exact tools, but to be able to have kind of like a toolbox they can pick from to see what works. So I think, yeah, those are the three things I would say are key in that vision: that sincere engagement, that inclusion in conversations and mechanisms and processes, and that strengthening of intergenerational knowledge, sharing and creation. Thank you.
Thank you, Detmer. And I what I really appreciate there, beyond just the wealth of content in that response, is your enthusiasm. I think that in atrocity spaces and atrocity prevention, but also just looking at impact of atrocity crimes, we very rarely have moments where we're like, this is what I'm really excited about right now. And so that was very refreshing. Kessie.
I will just add on what Detmer mentioned. I think when I think about the future, I see our responsibility, as young people, like there's plenty of us like Khaled, like me, Jan, and all around the world, we are a lot. But the more and more, when I think about it, I just think about like the next generation. When we talk about intergenerational dynamic, I don't see just with our parents and other, I also see us, like how we can like just, work with our younger brother and sister and also talk to them about what we know, what we learn, what we are afraid of. I think it's a kind of conversation that we don't do a lot most of the time we see children as just children, but for instance, I think that they see a lot of things. As I just mentioned before, it's like we are a generation that saw a lot of things, like very bad things. So we know what war is and other. And so I think young children are even clearer than they was maybe 20 years ago. So I think it's important to have that intergenerational dynamic coming from us young people, you know, via to our younger brother and sister. The second thing that based on what I see on the field and the work that I do, is that it's so important for the future and even for our collaboration with the international community, with our government, to protect the civic space. This is the only opportunity that we can have, like to really talk and, you know, wave the flag and say there's something wrong is happening, or just to the prevention we are talking about, or even the early warning system we are talking about. In a context where there's no civic space, it is impossible for us. And for me, this is one of the main things that we have to keep working on. In Central African Republic, we see every single day how the civic space is shrinking. And to tell you the truth, it completely changed the way we are working. And we know that here we have something that is quite dangerous, because we see things coming, very bad things are coming, but it's just impossible for us to talk about it. So at that moment, I realized the importance and how precious a civic space is. So for me, focusing and working and protecting civic space is quite important. And to make the link between the civic space and the role of international community, I would say that it's important to think about better way to, you know, to facilitate the communication between international community and the young people. On the field in CAR, we saw that, as Dedmer just mentioned, and even Khaled and Youngin mentioned, we are in the room, but it's important for us to be also outside of the room. And when we are outside of the room, we need also to create channels where we can be in touch with international community. I think about like importance to develop or to really try to create some dynamic to help young people to share shadow report, for instance. I see it in my country, how it can help, how it can help young people to create a new relation with international community. And so for me, this is how I see the future, and work with our younger brother and sister, protect the civic space, and really create new channel of collaboration between international community, but outside the room most of the time. Thank you.
Thank you, Cassie. I'll turn now to Khalid.
Thank you so much. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I think we always need to think about the future. So I think for us here in the MENA region, we are going to focus more on supporting more local action by using regional exchange. And I'm saying regional exchange here because in the MENA region, young people represent 60 or 70% of the population, but also we have similar challenges in the region. Democracy does not exist. Civic spaces, including public spaces, digital spaces, private spaces, always been attacked by authorities, and armed conflict, disaster, and corruption is everywhere. So we need to see how these resources, the strong points where you have a huge population, young people are more resilient, young people trying to do actions everywhere, they visit all these issues, how they can be connected and connected for what we need. We think this local action require that they need to be safe by being protected digitally and physically. And this also can be done through the international community that need to always advocate for more civic spaces. And I totally agree with Cassie. We cannot talk about atrocity prevention when young people cannot prevent risks for themselves, or young people always afraid of the hand of the states if they say something or publish something that the state doesn't like. So here, prevention will not exist. And also, so I said about protection and well-being through also peer-to-peer well-being. And I think it's good that young people hear resilience, but also thinking about how young people can support each others in the region. And third will be finance, how we can also ensure that those youth-led groups, informal groups, and I'm saying informal because most of people doing action are informal groups. They cannot be registered due legal complications in this region. Like my organization, it's not registered in Egypt, registered somewhere else, which is showing how difficult to work legally in this region. So those organizations should have resources, or and I want to say sustainable resources to do the work. It doesn't, I said we were lucky to work with ICR2B on this project last year, and then we launched the regional network in prevention with the UN Office of Genocide Prevention, R2B. And one of the biggest achievement we did that we offered the micro grants for organization across the MENA region to do activities and to work to achieve their mission. And this is required like few $1,000, $3,000. Hundreds of workshops has been done in Syria, for example. So it's small resources, how we can ensure that this is sustainable. And if I want to say like, why do we need to support more local action? I will actually quote something from the former UN envoy on DRR, where she said the local level is where disaster and conflict happen, and therefore this is where actions must be taken. So I think it's clear for all of us that this is the local level. It's good to have work at the global level and dialogue, but we need also to make sure that we are supporting those local actors on the ground. This is required from the international community to ensure that these financial mechanisms that already exist accessible for these young people. So, when I say accessible, I mean the legal restrictions. I also mean the high standards of financial requirements mostly for donors, which is only fit for like big organization that has been there for many years in the western part of the world. We need to make sure that it's not the same for youth-led organization, and there is alternative or like, let's say, simple requirements for these organizations to access financial resources. And second, flexibility. I think atrocity preventions we heard here from Dietmar and Noyan and Cassie and myself, every one of us doing maybe different activities, but at the end, the goal is to prevent atrocities. In Syria, there is dialogue. Somewhere else required to work in hate speech. Somewhere else need to work in arms control. So we need to make sure that there is flexibility for young people to achieve their mission without changing the nature of their work, because of the lack of the resources, we have seen, unfortunately, that local organization will change their mission always to get enough resources, and this is not their fault. This is the donors' fault, because donors will come from top to down agendas that we need to work in gender, we need to work in climate change, or we need to work in peace building, and then these organizations are forced to change the nature of their work and change the mission that you established to achieve because of the donors. So again, in atrocity crime prevention, we need to make sure that this financial is available and it's flexible and that can give this organizations the opportunity to achieve what they believe that the community needed. And protection, we need to make sure that young people and this youth organization, at least they are protected when they share their voice at the global level, because we are afraid to share it at the local level, but also at the global level. We invite the participants from Middle East to a conference, and then they will be very careful about what to say and what to talk about because they are going back home. So to conclude, we need real protection from the international community, and we need a strong and accessible financial mechanism that can help this organization to implement effective and impactful work. Thank you.
Thank you, Khalid. And I, to go back to what Cassie said earlier about same struggle in different regions, you're both saying very similar points about this, the shrinking of civic space, the need for protection for these groups, and not just sort of leaving youth saying, this is your world to inherit, you have to fix it yourself, without actually providing them with support to do so. And so I think it's an important point that, to go back to what Dietmar was saying, you can't just create a seat at the table and sort of leave it at that seat. You have to give sort of useful space for youth, but you also have to make sure that the table still exists, and sort of, secure that civic space for those conversations. And lastly, I'll turn to Nyon Yin.
Yes, thank you. I really love what everyone has said so far. This kind of reinforces and confirms what young people from across the world really want to see. So I would just reiterate and add on a few points on what was already discussed. So regarding the civic space, yes, this is on the top of my priority list as well. Yes, I think we people need to recognize that protecting civic space for young human rights defenders is crucial. This means respecting and protecting their freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, and freedom of association. So we see many violence and harassment against young protesters all around the world. So young people such as those in Myanmar, we just want a safe space and peaceful space to express what we want for the future without being persecuted, right? So we don't want violence as well. We value our lives, right? So don't restrict this space and platform for us. And then at the same time, there are also those that perceive young people as naive and incapable to work on peace building and atrocity prevention. But the question that we should really be asking ourselves is, have we invested enough in our young people? So if what young people lack knowledge and skills, then we should be allocating more resources to build their capacity on advancing human rights, countering hate speech, promoting more responsible use of social media, and etc. So that they can also incorporate the lens of atrocity prevention in the work that they are passionate about. So there's so many intersecting issues that I think that Mer had talked about, like climate change, poverty, gender equality, and how all these are tied together when it comes to atrocity prevention, right? And young people should be able to learn how to talk about these different issues. And then at the same time, I think civil society and religious and community leaders should also be actively engaging young people in intercultural or interfaith dialogues to foster understanding, learning, and tolerance. And my last point is that in many countries around the world, past atrocity crimes are seen as a taboo subject, often due to government censorship or just shame in the society. So many young people who live in countries that have a history of atrocity crimes, the intergenerational trauma from their parents and grandparents are passed on to them. So my view is that societies that don't learn from the past are bound to make the same mistakes again. Studies have shown that countries that experience atrocity crimes without accountability, justice, and closure have a higher chance of reoccurrence of violence. So our hope is to see more initiatives from government and civil societies to open up discussions on past atrocities, help young people to heal, and empower young people, especially those from the marginalized groups, to find a voice and the right language to articulate their hopes and visions through various means. So yeah, I think I'm just echoing what everyone has said, but I think this really shows that young people want these spaces and these opportunities. Thank you.
Thank you, Nhan Nhan, and that was a really powerful way to end. So I don't want to take up any space after the reflections from the four of you, but I hope that everyone who attended today learned something and takes away some more nuanced perspective on how to better include youth in all of the initiatives we're carrying forward with atrocity prevention. Thank you so much to our panelists for sharing with us today, and have a good rest of your day.
Thank you.